Hey folks, welcome to Nodevember 2025. First prompt here, pumpkin. So I'm just starting out with a blank scene. I'm using Blender 5.0 beta. And I've just added in some geometry nodes, just grabbed a UV sphere and I'm using the position through some vector curves and then taking the Z axis through a float curve to affect the radius of that sphere. And that gives you like a lot of control. Really nice way of working. Feels very like sculpty. You really get to push around vertices that way. And then just to add a little bit more organicness to it, I'm doing a little bit of displacement just with a noise texture. And then simply using a bounding box node to shift it up so it's sat on the floor. Now I need to make the ribs. So what I did was I just took the position, separate X, Y, Z, take the X and the Y through an arctan2 node. That gives you like a minus pi to positive pi, like an angle essentially. And then you can do really whatever you want with it. So I'm just doing multiply by 6 and then pass that through a sine node. And then I decided that I was going to, rather than just using that even sine graph, I wanted it to sort of pinch in a more interesting way on the inner, I guess, like the grooves. I didn't want it to be fully pinched. I did try with absolute, but then I decided that I wanted it to just really bias that sine wave. So I just did some math transforms on there just to give me a bit more control, and I used a float curve to shift where that sine center was. And then simply just adding more noise to make it feel a bit more natural, and adding the noise early on as well so that it can shift how wide those different segments are. So that's the basic shape of the pumpkin, really quick. And then I wanted to add a stalk. So what I did was I created a few points and then just did like a points to curve and then set that to a Bezier with auto handles. That makes it smooth. And then I set the handle position for the base handle to be vertically above. That's what you can see me doing there, just to make sure that it always comes up vertically. For the profile curve on this, I did it a bit of a weird way. I just took a straight line and then turned it into a circle and then added another smaller circle to it, and that's why you can see that sort of indentation pattern there. And then again, I'm just doing some stuff with noise here to try and just make it feel a bit more organic, I guess. Just that's always the way with these procedural systems. You end up with a lot of stuff that just looks a little bit too perfect. Yeah, and then I was originally going to make a whole pumpkin patch, but I'm doing this on a MacBook Air and it just can't really keep up with doing lots of geometry like that. So you can see some parts of the system that I'm building are sort of with a view to be able to create multiples simultaneously. And that was what you just saw before, where I was scaling the stalk based on the bounding box of the body so that I could have different sized bodies and have it always fit. Now I'm working on the face cutout, so you can see I've taken a circle and I've displaced it with noise again. That's a pretty standard thing to do. And then I've added another circle, which is essentially the pupil of the eye. And you can see I'm messing around with the noise there just to give it a little bit of just kind of see what kind of expression I can get out of it. This part here, I was trying to work out if I could extend parts of the pupil up to the sides, because obviously if you cut a pumpkin, you want to not have floating parts like a pupil. So I needed to make sure that I was going to connect out to the sides of the rest of the eye hole. In the end, I went with a mesh circle and just extruded up and down, and you can see that there. So it's sort of got a cut through the eye, and it just leaves you with two holes rather than a floating pupil. Did a bit of stuff there just to make a pair of them as well, just with like a repeat zone. Now I'm creating the mouth using an arc, and pretty straightforward. Just take the arc segment, make it cyclic, so then you have a sort of string across there, and then just a bit of tweaking, just the same as we did with the curves on the sphere at the beginning for the actual shape of the pumpkin. We're just doing that here to work out what kind of controls we can get across this mouth. The cool thing about Nodevember is none of this stuff matters, right? It's not production, it's not real projects, you're just experimenting and you're having fun. So the goal here really for me, obviously I'm pretty familiar with geometry nodes, but I still want to explore ideas and things that I've not necessarily tried before and just have a really good look around basically. Blender is changing so much all the time, so it's really good to do this sort of thing and just give you an idea of like, oh, I can hack it this way, or I can do something really interesting with this new tool or whatever it might be. In this case, I am taking that math and I found that I could do a little bit of variation on the bottom lip position to make it look like it was opening and closing. Had a bit of a thought about doing an animation, but ended up not doing that, and then just took some random vertices from the bottom lip and it just pulled them upwards basically. And they're all, the eyes and the mouth are just a fill curve to get it as a solid mesh. Something I'm doing inside this blue zone, which is a for each zone, is I am taking each of my eyes, because I've made them both simultaneously, and I've done my fill curve, and that's given you that sort of 2D boolean to remove the pupil from the rest of the eye shape. And now I'm making sure that they are positioned so that they are like the right eye is positioned as if it's like hard left in a box, and then the left eye as if it's hard right in a box, if that makes sense. So the origin positions of those eyes become much more consistent irrespective of the shape of them. So it just makes it much more intuitive. Think of it like moving your anchor points or moving your origin on an object. So the next thing I wanted to do was create this kind of fan shape with this. So what I've done is I've created a boolean cutter for the face so that I can slice it out of the pumpkin. But I want it to be rounded rather than just projecting it straight through the front. I wanted to make sure that, like, obviously when you're cutting a pumpkin, you're cutting it sort of parallel to the normals of that pumpkin, right? So I wanted to bend it around, and I just did a little bit of maths there to remap the X position to be an angle. So I just took the X through cosine and sine, and then I took the Z as the new radius. And yeah, it's good to know a little bit of math like that. It's not particularly complicated, although it did take me a second to actually work out what was going on. What you can see me doing here is playing with the new SDF grids. Ended up not doing this eventually, but it was interesting to explore how these things were sort of being voxelized and making sure that I was creating manifold geometry so that I was adding the backs of the face cutter. Yeah, you can mix grids in a really interesting way. These new SDF grid models. Yeah, just again, Blender's developing, really exciting to see that happen still. And it's a really great way to be able to mix different parts of geometry as well. And also retopologize, not in a meaningful way, sort of voxelize, so you get an even geometry distribution. What you can see me doing now is just building some candles, super basic geometry, just basically taking a curve line, taking a circle, lofting it up it, and changing the radius, and that's it. And then I just take the top face, do a mesh to points on the faces, and that gives me the position that I want to instance the candle flame. And I'm just doing the exact same thing that we did at the beginning with sculpting out the shape of the pumpkin. I'm just taking a sphere again, and I'm twisting it around into an approximate candle flame shape. Join them all together, and then I'm sticking a noise texture across them all. I ended up adding this attribute as well that is the distance from the bottom of the flame, and that I thought would just be helpful for reducing the displacement at the bottom to make sure they always anchor to the candle, and also give me a bit of control if I come to do a shader later where I want to have a bit of a gradient across the flame. You can see now I'm just throwing some different basic colors on stuff, nothing too complicated, just flat colors really, and just making sure that I understand where things are isolated within the node graph. Setting up a camera, and then ended up not going for this this SDF grid remeshing stuff. Decided I was going to have a look at the new mesh boolean feature, which is the manifold boolean. Super fast, really worked well for me as far as I could tell, so had some good results with that. And then I was trying to work out how to improve the edges around the holes, because obviously you have geometry which is not, like, it doesn't care about the topology. It's really difficult to control topology meaningfully with procedural generation. And so sometimes you have to think about how you can negate some of the problems that have arisen. And what I decided to do was just try and pinch down some of those edges and give it a bit more volume around where the Boolean cutter had gone through. So I used the geometry proximity node to find the distance from my face cutter object, and then just use that to inflate along the normals the rest of the pumpkin after the Boolean. So again, not super complicated, but really just trying to work out what we can do to easily negate some of those problems. Ultimately, the rendering style that I went with meant that it didn't matter, so that ended up being totally fine. But again, this is just a really good experience to learn from and to see what tools are available, even if you end up not being able to see them in the final render. Obviously, if you're doing production stuff, you want to be a bit more optimized, but the point of Nodevember is to kind of care a bit less and just have a bit of fun and see what you can do. Again, here, playing with the volume coefficients node, which is a new one, I ended up not using it because I wanted a solid mesh surface. But it was interesting to see that you actually could get some pretty dense volumes, and there might be some interesting opportunities to play with that in various scenes. Started messing around with some lighting, added this sky texture with the new multiple scattering mode. So it came out really well, to be honest. I really like that new sky texture. I think it's doing a great job. And then I decided that I probably did want a bit of variation on the ground just to set a bit of a scene. Even though it was going to be a dark scene, I just wanted to make sure that there were just less hard edges, less straight edges. So I wanted to break it up a little bit. So I created a plane, new object, added a plane, curve line, which I just bent a little bit, and I used duplicate elements with the duplicate index. The index became the seed for different noise, so that each grass blade looked different. And then I also split to instances using that instance index, that duplicate index as the group ID, and that let me then instance on points each of these grass blades individually. Position them all over the plane, made them pretty dense, random rotation and scale, and then also wanted to bend them away from the pumpkin as if it was sat down. Again, you don't see it in the final scene, but it's just a nice thing to be able to point them away from an object. In this case, because it was on the origin, I just set the rotation. You can use like align rotation to vector with the position. If you think about the position, it's always sort of like if you imagine an arrow from 0 to the position, it's always pointing away from the center. So you can use that to flatten everything out, and then just using the factor to control the distance of that flattening around the pumpkin. Again, adding a bit of displacement. There's one of these new assets, which is for displacing geometry. And then I started having a play with some in-camera effects. So this is not compositing, this is just exploring what happens with a glass torus in this case. Messing around with that, and then I tried a few different bits of geometry, ended up playing with a sort of dual concave lens, which I also cut a hole in the middle of, and it's just a fun way to play with it. As soon as you start messing around with white noise and refraction, though, which is what I'm doing here, the noise gets a bit crazy. So you do have to be prepared for that. You can see I'm making that lens there. It was all just a little bit too much. I was also using depth of field on the camera to knock stuff out. Cut a hole in the middle just to make sure that I could actually see through to the pumpkin. And I was just using this sort of disc shape then to give a bit more of an interesting shape around the outside. Came back in, decided I didn't like the face too much that I'd landed on it. It was completely random. So I just went through and had to play with some more options there, just testing out different random seeds until I found some things which I quite liked. And then a bit more exploring, a bit more tweaking. Also wanted to make sure that there was a hole cut in the top. So even though we were going to keep the top of the pumpkin on, I wanted to have a sort of circle cut out of it as if the top had been taken off to empty it. And that just allows a little bit more interest with the subsurface scattering as it bleeds around the pumpkin, just to give it a little bit more of something on top. A small detail, but I think it did add a little bit. And then, yeah, just played with compositing for a bit, really. There was a few things. I didn't really keep it in this recording, unfortunately. I just sort of went off and messed around myself, but I will probably talk about compositing more in the future. But with all of the prompts that I do manage to get to this month, check down in the description. There is the file available for free from Patreon. You can just click that link and download it. You don't need to be a member. You can just grab the file. All right, there we go. That was day one, pumpkin. Hope you've enjoyed. Hope you learned something. I'll catch you in the next one.